We read today from the book of Esther. The story begins with violence, lust, and power. And no, we are not talking about Game of Thrones. We are talking about King Ahasuerus, who ruled over the lands and the peoples, and who executed his previous queen for disrespecting his order to showcase herself to his party guests. And so the king was now lonely, and it was determined that there would be a beauty pageant to discover the next queen over all of the land. Many women either sought this opportunity or were forced to participate. Young Esther, a Jewish orphan, was one of these young women forced to do so. She was cared for by her older cousin, Mordecai, who cared for the orphan Esther as his own daughter. He told her that if she was to avoid oppression by the hands of the king and his guard, it'd be best not to reveal her Jewish identity. So she kept it a secret. Her natural beauty caught the king's eye, and she became queen. Unbeknownst to her, one of the king's advisors, Haman, was secretly plotting to destroy all the Jewish people within the kingdom. Mordecai got wind of this evil plan and told Esther. Would it be possible that young Esther, now queen over all the land, would be able to stop the genocide from happening? Or would she suffer the same fate as the previous queen if she found herself on the wrong side of the king's wrath and outed for her Jewish identity? So let us now listen for God's holy word coming from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. Esther spoke and gave a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your family and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Sisters and brothers, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may or may not know this picture in front of us. Her name is Greta Thunberg. She is 16 years old and lives in Sweden. She is soft-spoken, shy, really, and doesn't necessarily stand out in a crowd. Yet much of the world today is listening to this young woman. She's quoted as saying, "All my life I've been invisible. The invisible girl in the back who doesn't say anything," she said. "From one day to another, people now listen to me." And that's a weird contrast. It's hard. You see, Greta's fame started when she posted on social media about protesting climate change by not attending school during her country's election season. News of her protest went viral around the world, and it soon became a movement to raise awareness of climate change for young people and old alike. The shy girl soon became the center of attention, having the opportunity to meet with people like Barack Obama and Pope Francis. Even as we gathered here this morning, Greta is sailing on a carbon-neutral yacht as a symbol and gesture of her message. She will be one of the main speakers at the upcoming United Nations Climate Summit talks in New York City in a few weeks' time. Reflecting on her actions that have galvanized a global movement to take action in caring for our natural world, this shy young woman simply states, "If I did not fight, I'd feel bad," she explained. "When I grow up, I want to be able to look back and say I did what was possible." Can one young woman change the world? I'll leave that thought for us to reflect upon as we engage with our scripture story this morning. So we continue with our series on lesser-told Bible stories and characters this week as we tell the story of Esther. In many ways, I find Greta's story to be similar to Esther's. Both young women really never seeking fame or notoriety, yet here they are, serving as a figurehead for a movement that affects entire communities and peoples. Yes, fame seems like a wonderful experience for many, but with it also comes a negative side effects. I'm sure if Esther lived in a social media generation back then, she would be getting the same negative exposure and comments that Greta is receiving. People mock, second guess, and doubt the intentions of such leaders who dare to speak out against the norm. Some people even respond in hate and anger. The life of leadership, whether one seeks it or not, or it's bestowed upon them, is never quite as lovely as it seems. For such a time as this, for such a time as climate change that affects millions of humans and other species each and every day, for such a time as refugees and immigrants seeking better livelihoods around the world, for such a time as mass shootings and the epidemic of gun violence within our own nation, for such a time as social unrest and protests over government corruption, for such a time as race relations, racism, and white supremacy, Antifa and Proud Boys, for such a time as gender identity and hate crimes, for such a time as rising housing costs and with it rising homelessness, for such a time as a loss of faith, for such a time as this. We can imagine young Esther's roller coaster of emotions during this time in her life. There she was, an orphan Jewish girl living in a land occupied by the king and his advisors. And next thing she knows, she is forced to parade in front of the king in a beauty pageant. Is she a true rags to riches story? So she is now queen with the world at her fingertips, yet she's also living in fear because she knows how the previous queen fared against the king's wrath. And here comes Mordecai, who knows and loves her, yet he asks her to literally risk her life. We pick up again in verse 10. Esther spoke and gave a message for Mordecai saying, "Well, all the king's servants and people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, all alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. And we can understand then why Esther hesitated with Mordecai's request. And yet Mordecai responds with yet more honesty and perhaps a challenge to the young queen. Verse 12, when they told Mordecai what Esther said, he replied, "Do you not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews? For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. And what a precarious position for young Esther to find herself in. After all, how many of us have ever been asked to risk our lives to save others? And by our parents or guardians, no less. Verse 15, then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. After that, I will go to the king, though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And there is a happy ending to this story. The king listened to Esther's request. Haman was ultimately executed for his role in masterminding the attempted genocide. Mordecai was exalted. And Queen Esther ruled with authority as the Jewish people were saved. For such a time as this. I wonder what this phrase could mean in our own lives today. Sure, it'd be easy to raise up Esther as the one person who saved all of the Jewish people, and for us to say that we need a savior like Esther or Greta Thunberg or someone else, anyone else to save us from ourselves. But there were others involved as well. Mordecai, the older generation to Esther, loved her, raised her, and spoke words of inspiration and hope into her life. There were others who were barely mentioned who also prayed and fasted for salvation and discernment. And God was there, not mentioned in the book of Esther, mind you, but present and moving the entire time. It seems it was not just one person to act alone. And so if we reframe our thinking then, the phrase for such a time as this is not just a battle cry for an individual or a younger generation or simply a hashtag. No, for such a time as this is our good news today for all people. We are called for this particular community, for this particular time, for such a time as this. God is moving among us, all of us, right here today. Where do we see it? Where can we point to in the world and say, hey, look, there. God is moving there for such a time as this. And where can we look to each other and to ourselves and say, this is what I have been put here. In this particular place, in this particular time, for such a time as this. May this phrase for such a time as this become not just a one-liner in the face of the world's injustices and with it opportunities for action and for good. May this phrase seep into our very being. We have all been called for such a time as this.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past, and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.